Hello again everyone, and welcome back. This time around, I'll be covering my take on the powerful Blade Vortex Chieftain. A versatile spellcaster, capable of doing just about everything well. It clears about as fast as we can run, shredding through and instantly exploding everything we touch without the use of an explode chest, allowing the build to fly through maps and trivialize league mechanics at an absurd pace. Against bosses, it can muster some impressive damage, but requires that we stay reasonably close to the boss's position to consistently deal that damage. A downside offset by our mobility and strong defensive capability. With help from tools like Vaal Righteous Fire, Wave of Conviction, and a destructive Vaal Blade Vortex, the build efficiently cuts through bosses of just about every type and caliber. Backing up this offensive capability is a strong collection of defensive layers. The build can reach up and even over 8,000 life, has high chaos resistance, very high physical damage reduction with 5 endurance charges, blinds enemies on hit, in both Aspect of the Spider and Temporal Chains to dramatically reduce the threat that enemies pose. On top of that, the build has powerful life sustain. It leeches life, passively regenerates 11 to 17% of maximum life per second, automatically triggers Feast of Flesh, and also automatically triggers an instant enduring cry bound as our movement key. All of this combining to ensure a smooth experience through virtually all content. Finally, the ability to engage all types of content while remaining on the move is a perk that cannot be understated. It bolsters every aspect of the build's performance, allowing us to engage and disengage at will, manually dodge incoming attacks with ease, and deal consistent damage, even when avoiding it ourselves. Thus, the build is very viable in hardcore. Just be sure to maximize your life pool and push the build defensively to its limits with the options provided. Gearing up this build requires a reasonable level of investment. It utilizes a variety of mostly affordable uniques and rares, but certain core items can prove to be fairly expensive, especially early on in leagues. I'll be including cheap alternatives for just about every equipment slot and discussing effective ways to get the build going on lower budgets. Even moderate investment will earn you very respectable performance. As illustrated here, the build is capable of running high-tier maps with no weapon whatsoever. Even running some of the most hyper-budget options available to the build will still net you more overall damage than that. However, several unique items are crucial to get the build's performance fully online, rendering this one not easily viable in solo self-found, and only semi-viable as a league starter. The inherent power of Blade Vortex and cheap alternatives can get you mapping without much investment, but I only recommend a league starting this if you're comfortable making a lot of currency very quickly, or you're willing to deal with taking a performance hit until key pieces can be picked up. But if you've got some currency ready to go and want to decimate content while remaining impressively tanky, this build is an incredibly easy recommendation. So stick around as we take a deeper look at how to put it together. This guide utilizes the free program Path of Building to summarize and display its key information. Simply copy in the pastebin link below, and you'll have access to skill gems, gear sets, and skill trees for every stage of the build's progression. If you're watching this in a league following 3.11, the Path of Building will have been updated. Changes made will be in the Path of Building notes and video description. And if you're enjoying the guide so far, consider subbing for more just like it. Now let's get started by taking a look at the build's core features, primary modifiers, and endgame skill tree. All the decisions made are tailored around using Blade Vortex as our primary skill. Blade Vortex is a duration-based spell that deals 100% physical damage. As the gem levels, it gains additional physical damage and radius. When cast, an ethereal blade is summoned that orbits our character for 5 seconds, intermittently dealing damage to anything within its radius. Up to 10 blades can be active at one time. Each active blade increases Blade Vortex's critical strike chance by 10%, hit rate by 35%, and grants a staggering 35% more damage. Its Vaal counterpart creates an independent Blade Vortex that for a short duration automatically seeks out nearby enemies. This can be used alongside our main Blade Vortex to heavily improve our single target damage and to help us clear league mechanics like blights and legions with ease. Now let's take a look at how we're going to offensively be building around Blade Vortex. Here are the top offensive notables. Core focuses and primary modifiers will be scaling. The build wields a bow and quiver, heavily increases the level of Blade Vortex, converts 100% of its physical damage into fire damage, and is not critical strike focused. Instead, it makes use of the keystone Elemental Overload by investing just enough into critical strike chance to consistently proc the 40% more damage that it grants. The build also makes use of these buffs and these debuffs to improve our damage output. A few things worth noting. We'll be allocating the cluster Potency of Will for the skill effect duration it provides. This increases the duration of each Blade Vortex cast, making it far easier to maintain 10 stacks consistently. This isolated notable comes from the anointment on our amulet. spending a point or two on notables like these to help meet dexterity requirements is advised if needed. Now let's continue moving forward and discuss the defensive focuses and primary modifiers we'll be looking for. The build is completely life-based, leeches and regenerates life, scales chaos resistance, defensively curses enemies with temporal chains, blinds enemies on hit, improving our chance to evade to 50% against them, invests pretty heavily into the general category of endurance charges, armor, and physical damage reduction, and uses Enduring Cry defensively with the keystone Call to Arms to make its use instantaneous. Temporal Chains is a curse that primarily lowers enemies' action speed, in practice meaning we have less incoming damage to avoid. Manually dodging becomes much easier, and we can more effectively dictate how we engage enemies. We'll be making use of jewel sockets across the tree to place rare jewels that increase our life pool, scale our damage, and shore up any needed resistances or attributes. Sustaining mana with this build hinges on the unique helmet, the Devouring Diadem. Even though we aren't casting a lot, Blade Vortex is expensive per use, but this helmet grants us Eldritch Battery, which causes our energy shield to protect mana instead of life, where it can then be spent in place of mana for skill costs, allowing us to take advantage of energy shield recharge and leech to improve sustain. The Devouring Diadem also grants Feast of Flesh, which automatically triggers every 5 seconds, consuming up to 10 nearby corpses that we didn't explode. Each corpse consumed grants us 400 life, 400 energy shield, and 200 mana, adding another crucial layer to our life and effective mana sustain. If you don't yet have a Devouring Diadem, I recommend temporarily leaving 25 to 50% of your mana unreserved, and run an Enduring Divine Mana Flask to keep your mana consistently full. Finally, you may have noticed that the primary tree I'm recommending does use cluster jewels. We stand to gain quite a bit from their inclusion, but included in the POB will be an alternative skill tree that doesn't feature any cluster jewels at all. My recommended setup will ideally look something like this, featuring 1 large cluster and 2 medium clusters. I don't recommend using any small clusters. Instead, place solid rare jewels in the final sockets. Focus on getting the primary notables. Any other secondary notables you can cram in are a fantastic bonus. Treat this setup as a baseline to be modified according to your budget and preferred playstyle. With that covered, let's move along and discuss what our Ascendancy of Chieftain brings to the build. Up first, we have Namahu, Flame's Advance, which converts half of our physical damage into fire damage, combining with our endgame Quiver to achieve 100% fire conversion. Additionally, for 4 out of every 10 seconds, this node grants us 100% of our physical damage as extra fire. This is an absurdly strong, but unfortunately inconsistent increase to our damage output. Timing your burst damage with its activation is very possible, but wasn't something I did often. Most of the time, it will just be a nice coincidence when it activates during a boss fight. Second, we have the newly buffed Hinekora Death's Fury, which increases strength, grants much needed life leech from fire damage, and now has a 100% chance to cover all rare and unique enemies in Ash for 10 seconds on hit. Affected enemies have 20% less movement speed and take 20% increased fire damage. This is a form of More Multiplier, significantly improving our damage output against all notable enemies. Third, we've got Tesalio Cleansing Water, which grants life regeneration, ignite immunity, 100% to our fire resistance, and converts 10% of physical damage taken into fire damage. Anytime the build does receive fire damage, our life recovery rate is increased by 50% for the next 4 seconds, ensuring that in many situations we bounce back to full life exceedingly quickly. Furthermore, 100% to fire resistance is huge and makes gearing up this build far more flexible and affordable. And finally, that brings us to the newly buffed Valako Storm's Embrace, which provides an additional maximum endurance charge, grants an endurance charge every second if we've Warcried recently, increases our life regeneration for each active charge, and grants 15% more damage for 8 seconds when we lose an endurance charge. Our main method for triggering this buff is a cast when damage taken, a Mortal Call. As a result, the buff will be up frequently, but does not have permanent uptime. Alternatively, for those who want consistent damage, Ramako Sun's Light is a legitimate consideration, but in my opinion, just doesn't offer enough. When picking up your Ascendancies, here's my recommended, but very flexible order. Forging onward, let's talk about our Bandit selection. For this build, there's really only one good option, and that's killing all of the Bandits. Oak is slightly tempting, but we can make good use of every skill point available. So put each of the Bandits 6 feet under, and collect your 2 passive points from Aramir. Next, let's discuss the best Pantheons available. Regardless of your choice, be sure to capture every additional soul. For the Major God, I recommend running Lunaris. We tend to get fairly close to the enemies we fight, The extra movement speed and physical damage reduction is always welcome, and the solid chance to dodge attacks, dodge spells, and avoid projectiles never hurts. The Minor God is very flexible. I recommend Gurukhan for the conditional evasion and movement speed. Pushing forward, let's take a look at the skills and links that fuel the build. Beginning first with our Vaal Blade Vortex 6-link, socketed directly into our endgame bow or chest piece if you're using an alternative setup. Every additional level of Blade Vortex makes a huge difference, so prioritize getting a level 21 Vaal Blade Vortex over getting gem quality. In slots 2, 3, and 4, we'll be linking our best in slot pure damage increases. Each gem comes with small but acceptable downsides. Elemental Focus prevents Blade Vortex from inflicting Ignite, but we have other sources of Ignite. Concentrated Effect lowers its, well, area of effect, but we're focused more on exploding enemies than scaling Blade Vortex's actual area of effect. And Controlled Destruction lowers its critical strike chance, but the build isn't critical strike focused. In the 5th slot, we have Empower Support, which increases the level of linked active support gems, in this case Blade Vortex. We want Empower at as high a level as possible, ideally level 4. At that level, Empower raises the level of Blade Vortex by 3, but when placed into an endgame bow like this, Empower can reach level 7, in turn increasing the level of Blade Vortex by 6. This is a truly staggering DPS increase, and the most value we can get from a single support gem. In the final slot, we have Unleash Support. This causes Blade Vortex to gain seals over time. When Blade Vortex is cast, these seals will be consumed, causing Blade Vortex to repeat once for each seal used. This allows us to reach the maximum of 10 blades far quicker, improving the usability of Blade Vortex immensely. Without it, maintaining high Blade Vortex stacks is an arduous endeavor, making Unleash more of a requirement than a recommendation. Furthermore, the damage Blade Vortex does is defined by its initial cast, meaning that it won't be affected by the less damage multiplier Unleash normally grants. If you can't afford a reasonably leveled Empower, or don't have an endgame weapon to properly support it, temporarily run Fire Penetration Support instead. And if you've got the currency, consider upgrading to these Awakened support gems. Up next, we've got our Aura setup, a 4-link socketed directly into our endgame helmet, the Devouring Diadem, which significantly lowers the mana reservation of our socketed auras, allowing us to cram far more auras into the build than would normally be possible. This includes Herald of Purity for the more physical damage, Zealotry mainly for the more spell damage, but also for the critical strike chance and Consecrated Ground, and finally our best aura, Herald of Ash, for the more spell fire damage and large chunk of our physical damage as extra fire. All 3 will be linked to an enlightened support between levels 2 and 4, which effectively lowers the mana reservation of these auras even further. The Devouring Diadem increases the level of all socketed gems by 1, allowing a level 2 Enlighten to free up just enough mana to make room for Aspect of the Spider, which we'll be picking up as a suffix on one of our rare items. Our next setup is a pair of 2 links that can be socketed flexibly into our gloves or boots. The first 2-link is our Cast When Damage Taken setup at these exact levels. When Cast When Damage Taken's damage threshold is met, it will automatically trigger any linked spells that have a required level equivalent to or less than that of Cast When Damage Taken itself. We'll be keeping Cast When Damage Taken at level 1 so the threshold stays low, ensuring that Immortal Call will be triggered often. Immortal Call is a guard skill that heavily reduces the amount of damage we take for a short time. It will consume any endurance charges we have to increase its duration and reduce incoming physical damage even further. In this build, this has the added benefit of activating the damage buff granted by Velako Storm's Embrace. The second 2-link is our Boss Debuff, composed of either Wave of Conviction or Armageddon Brand, linked to Combustion support. Both spells can inflict Ignite, causing Combustion to lower their fire resistance by up to 20%. Wave of Conviction also inflicts fire exposure, which lowers enemies' fire resistance by another 25%. I recommend sticking with Wave of Conviction until you pick up a cluster jewel featuring Master of Fire or Heraldry. At that stage, I advise switching over to the more consistent and longer-lasting Armageddon Brand. Our final gem setup is a 2-link and 2 unlinked skills that can again be flexibly socketed into either our gloves or our boots. The 2-link is composed of Dash, or Flame Dash, linked to Second Wind support. These are travel skills that allow us to cover ground quickly and cross gaps without losing Blade Vortex stacks. Second Wind grants an additional maximum use. Which of the 2 skills you choose is up to you. I prefer Dash. The first of our unlinked skills is Enduring Cry, a powerful defensive war cry that regenerates us around 2000 life over 1 second, essentially acting as an additional life flask. It also grants endurance charges based upon the power of nearby enemies, and a small duration-based buff. In the final slot, we'll be running Vaal Righteous Fire. Don't use the regular Righteous Fire, only the Vaal portion of the skill, which for a short time grants up to 28% more spell damage. When activated, it will sacrifice 30% of our total life and energy shield, a very small downside to this build, as it will be recovered almost instantly. Alternatively, if you'd like to run a utility skill like Blood Rage or Vaal Grace, you can run a setup like this. With that, it's time that we move on and discuss how to best map and boss with this build. Here are the keybinds that I used. In general, you can treat this as a baseline to be modified in any way that you see fit. However, I highly recommend using Enduring Cry as your move-only key by assigning it to left-click. We pick up Call to Arms, making our Warcry instantaneous. This prevents Enduring Cry from ever stalling us, allowing us to move freely while automatically triggering Enduring Cry whenever its cooldown is up. Mapping with this build is as simple and straightforward as it gets. Keep your utility flasks up consistently. Try to maintain a high level of Blade Vortex stacks and run through the map. Everything you touch will instantly explode or be shredded quickly. Find a good rhythm for recasting Blade Vortex that works for you. Try to take a second or two between each cast to allow seals to build up. Use your movement skill frequently to cross empty space and to blink directly into packs for near instant chain explosions. Use the high mobility to your advantage and stay consistently on the move. And finally, don't hesitate to use Vaal Blade Vortex to help boost your clear during intense encounters. During boss fights, reach 10 stacks of Blade Vortex before engaging and maintain it from there. Cast Wave of Conviction or attach Armageddon Brand to apply Ignite and Elemental Exposure if necessary. As you approach the boss, activate Vaal Righteous Fire and your utility flasks. And always remember to use Vaal Blade Vortex. It provides a massive amount of bonus damage and will help you wrap up fights far quicker. Manually avoid incoming damage while staying close enough to the boss to deal consistent damage yourself. Don't hesitate to dash out momentarily if you need an opportunity to heal. During longer fights, occasionally recast your debuffs and lean on Enduring Cry to keep you sustained. As you approach endgame mapping, here are the map modifiers you should keep in mind. Only Elemental Damage Reflection is impossible to run. Every other modifier is doable, but a few can prove annoying. In particular, monsters being hexproof prevents our explosions from triggering, limiting our clear speed. Now let's continue forward and discuss how to best level the build. First, we'll take a look at the leveling skill trees included in the path of building. This will range from very early progression into the mid-game, early endgame, and finally our endgame tree. If you're leveling this as a league starter, simply make use of the best rare gear that you can find and utilize common flask options like these. Or if you're leveling this as a later character and have currency available, here are some of the best uniques you can run to make your leveling experience as easy as possible. And here are my recommended leveling gems setups. From levels 1 to 12, you can run whatever you feel comfortable with. What I have here is just one possible setup. From level 12 onwards, I recommend using Blade Vortex. Simply expand your setup as you gain additional links. Get Enduring Cry set as your move only as soon as you pick up Call to Arms. Run a Wave of Conviction setup like this to debuff bosses, and a dash setup like this to improve your mobility early on. Run Herald of Purity and Herald of Ash, but leave out Zealotry for now so that you have plenty of mana to work with. Be sure to run a mana flask if needed. Many of these gems aren't easily available to Marauders. How you source the gems is up to you, but there are plenty of options available. You can buy some from vendors, get most from the library in Act 3, buy any of them from other players, or buy them from vendors on another character that you already leveled. It's finally time that we move into the endgame gear that defines the build. Path of Exile's economy is completely player-driven. Prices are at the mercy of supply and demand and will likely shift over time. As a result, I'll be using these broad tiers of price to better estimate the future cost of the items discussed. Let's begin with our endgame weapon, which will be a flexibly priced bow like this, with various options ranging from hyper budget on the far left to optimized endgame rares on the far right. Most of our focus is on improving the level of Blade Vortex, Empower, and our other support gems through these listed modifiers. Even the budget options can provide very respectable performance. The build is fully capable of clearing high-tier maps with no weapon whatsoever, just running a tabula rasa. Look for something that fits your budget above all else and work towards upgrading in the future. Any of these bows will couple perfectly with our moderately expensive quiver, the Signal Fire, which converts the remaining 50% of our physical damage into fire and grants up to a substantial 35% of our physical damage as extra fire damage. If you've got currency spilling from your ears, look for an expensive Signal Fire with this corruption. Worth noting, our skill tree and Ascendancy provide completely generic damage increases, meaning you can flexibly run any of these other options that you like. However, it can be difficult to achieve a similar level of damage without very good items, and switching up the gear will require some changes to the build, listed here. For our body armor, I heavily recommend the moderately priced Comb's Heart, which grants us 500 flat maximum life and up to 40% increased fire damage. This comes at the cost of having no sockets whatsoever, a downside the build is completely designed to work around. With our heavy life investment on the skill tree, that 500 life becomes around 1,700, a ridiculous amount to get from a single item, and it even comes with a reasonable damage boost. And if you have a high budget, here are several powerful corruptions worth looking for. Comb's Heart tends to be reliably affordable, even early in leagues. It has several farmable divination cards. If you're low on funds early on, I recommend temporarily running one of these affordable uniques or a rare with good life and resistances. Alternatively, for those on a high budget, you can consider running an expensive rare chest piece like this, featuring a slightly more flexible version of the Explode modifier found on our endgame gloves. Going this route will have a significant impact on your total life pool and deviates quite a bit from the primary version of the build. As a result, I don't recommend this for most players. But if you have a high budget and want to tune the build a bit more offensively, this is a good place to start. Our helmet and primary mana solution is the cheap Devouring Diadem, which grants some energy shield, raises the level of socketed gems, and reduces the amount of mana auras reserve, allowing us to run far more than usual. Finally, it sustains our skill usage with Eldritch Battery and Feast of Flesh, which I discuss in more depth in the build basics. If you can't get a hold of one right away, I recommend running one of these cheap uniques, or a solid rare with plenty of life and resistances. Here are the best helmet enchantments available. Getting a good enchantment on a Devouring Diadem is not cheap. Unless you have a ton of currency, I don't recommend worrying about it. Instead, focus your attention on other pieces of gear, such as our gloves, which will be the expensive Osanoth's Gentle Touch, which grants a solid amount of life and curses enemies on hit with temporal chains, slowing them heavily, apparently even through death, as the curse will linger on corpses. Enemies near the cursed corpses are blinded and explode when killed, dramatically improving our clear speed. These will typically be very expensive for the first couple weeks of a league, but tend to steadily decline over time. Currently they are quite affordable, but this is very subject to change. If you haven't managed to lock some down, I recommend running a flexibly priced rare like this. Our boots will be flexibly priced rares that look like these. Prioritize getting life, high movement speed, elemental resistances, dexterity if needed, and some chaos resistance if you can afford it. This is one of several gear slots on which you can obtain or craft Aspect of the Spider. Here are the best boot enchantments available. I heavily recommend looking for a pair of pre-enchanted boots or enchanting a pair yourself with 120% increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently. This modifier makes a huge difference in keeping Elemental Overload active consistently. Our Amulet will be a flexibly priced rare like this. Prioritize getting life and as many of these powerful offensive modifiers as you can get. Any dexterity, resistances, or secondary damage modifiers you can find are a nice bonus. And again, this is one of the slots on which you can obtain Aspect of the Spider. Once you have a good amulet secured, you're going to want to anoint it. Here are my top recommendations. Our rings can be a variety of flexible options. You could run 2 Circles of Anguish. These boast a variety of modifiers, a huge range of possible implicits, and 2 random Herald of Ash related modifiers. A value version will simply feature Herald of Ash has up to 60% increased buff effect, alongside one of the cheaper defensive modifiers, and if possible, some helpful implicits. The ultimate rings for the build will look like this, featuring the Herald of Ash buff effect and increased fire damage as well. These are exceedingly strong, but exceedingly expensive to match. Alternatively, consider Circles of Guilt, the Herald of Purity counterpart to the Circle of Anguish. These have been affordable this league, and feature a better array of inherent modifiers. If you go this route, you'll need to get one like this, with Herald of Purity buff effect and percentage increased physical damage. Some solid implicits wouldn't hurt either. An affordable alternative worth consideration is a cheap Mark of the Shaper, combined with an Elder-influenced rare that looks something like this. Our belt will be a flexibly priced rare. I recommend a Stygian Vise. so we can place an abyssal jewel within it. But if you're on a budget, a leather belt can do really good work. Look for life, elemental resistances, and some chaos resistance if you can afford it. And if you haven't obtained or crafted Aspect of the Spider yet, you can also do that here. Now let's continue on and take a look at the flask options available. Up first, I recommend a cheap Quicksilver flask like these. The faster we run, the faster we can clear with Blade Vortex, and a flask like this can go a long way. Our second flask is cheap and flexible. Here are a few different choices. Regardless of what you choose, the prefix is flexible, but the suffix should be of heat for the crucial immunity to freeze and chill. For our third flask, I recommend running an affordable Divine Life flask with a flexible prefix and a suffix of staunching for the immunity to bleeding. If you can shore up immunity to bleeding on a different flask, you can consider running a cheap Blood of the Karwi for the ridiculous life recovery that it grants. Up fourth, we've got the cheap Wise Oak, which provides some powerful offensive and defensive modifiers that are active conditionally based upon the balancing of our uncapped resistances. Balancing all three like this is ideal but fairly difficult. At least ensure that your fire is highest to maximize offensive benefit, and try to balance lightning and cold to get as much out of it defensively as we can. Our final flask is very flexible. I recommend going with Cinder Swallow or Itziri's Promise. Both have a lot to offer the build. Itziri's Promise is far more available and affordable, but if you've got the currency, look for a Cinder Swallow like this. And with that, we've arrived at our final stop, the jewels of the build. In many sockets across the tree, we'll be placing flexibly priced rare jewels that look something like these. Try to get percentage increased life and 2 helpful damage rolls, or percentage increased life, alongside any attribute or resistance requirements that you need help meeting. If you're running a Stygian Vise, look for a flexibly priced rare abyssal jewel like one of these. A Thread of Hope unique jewel with a medium radius can be used to good effect in this socket. It's worth consideration, but I found it a bit underwhelming. And that just about covers everything. If you end up running this build, I hope the guide serves you incredibly well. A huge thank you to my patrons. Producing this content wouldn't be possible without them. Recognition goes to the following for their dedicated support: Adam Banamias, Agent Leo, Andrew Miller, Austin Meredith, Beanie, Bloody, Christopher Cravey, Chris IRL, Christopher Murdoch, Daniel Wigg, Darren Clark, David Cantu, Duke Nguyen, Gareth Thomas, Garth Anderson, Greg Wells, Hunter Wild, It's Mr. Worm to You Gaming, Jacob Davey, John Snyder, Kevin Griffin, Kevin Langevin, Kurt Wood, Lukash Galik, Michael Johnson, Michael McKee, Mick Woodney, Modimus Prime, Nate, Piotr, Rasmus Blockpelsko, Ray Hill, Renegade, Richard Bollinger, Ryan McDonald, Sebaton Babylon, Sinister Data, Spencer Ripe, Tony G 773, Truzado, Varos Vitele, William Dean, Wyatt Sabold, and finally, Xi. An additional thank you to Modimus Prime, Darren Clark, Greg Wells, Nate, and Michael Johnson for their extra support, and a final thank you to Modimus Prime for the assistance. If you'd like to be credited at the end of each video, or join our Discord for Path of Exile and channel discussion, consider checking out the Patreon link below. If you've got any questions or feedback, leave me a comment, and if you enjoyed the video I put together, consider subbing to the channel for more coming guides. And as always, I've been Esero, and I will see you guys in the next video.